Imagine a soldier, forged in the iron discipline of Imperial Japan, indoctrinated with a code that valued absolute loyalty and suicidal resolve above all else. For him, capture wasn't just a defeat, it was a fate worse than death itself, an ignominious end promising torture, starvation, or a swift, brutal execution. His mind would be a maelstrom of fear and shame, bracing for the inevitable. But what if, instead of the expected horror, he was offered a breakfast of fluffy pancakes drizzled generously with maple syrup, alongside a cup of hot coffee? This wasn't some feverish dream on a battlefield hospital cot. This exact, surreal scene unfolded in the Pacific Theater during the brutal island-hopping campaigns of late 1943. Private Kenjiro Ishikawa, captured on Bougainville after a grueling skirmish on December 12th, found himself staring at this impossible meal, the sweet, earthy scent of syrup mingling with the metallic tang of fear and disbelief. In the next 40 minutes, we'll dive deep into how this seemingly minor detail became a silent weapon, chipping away at an entire army's resolve, and why its echoes still shape our understanding of conflict today. The Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine was absolute: fight to the death. Surrender was not merely discouraged, it was considered a profound dishonor, a betrayal of the emperor and one's ancestors, punishable by ostracization, or worse, by your own hand. Soldiers were taught that American and Allied forces were barbaric, that captivity meant unimaginable torment. This propaganda, hammered home through every facet of military and civilian life, created a terrifying psychological barrier against surrender. For a Japanese soldier, the very concept of becoming a prisoner of war was antithetical to his existence, his training, and his cultural identity. This unyielding ethos was tragically demonstrated time and again, from the caves of Okinawa to the jungles of Saipan, where thousands chose suicide over capture. Yet, here was Private Ishikawa, shivering not from cold, but from a confusion deeper than fear, confronted by a plate that defied every narrative he had ever been told. The American mess tent was surprisingly orderly, the air thick with the smell of fried bacon and freshly brewed coffee, a stark contrast to the sparse, often desperate rations his own unit had endured for weeks. This wasn't the starvation he expected. This wasn't the torture. It was a breakfast that many American families enjoyed back home, served on a battered metal plate by a young, surprisingly calm medic. This culinary anomaly, a testament to American logistical prowess and a profoundly different cultural approach to human life, began to pry open the mental fortifications built by years of imperial propaganda. But how could such a simple act of hospitality be considered a weapon? And what did it reveal about the fundamental differences between the two warring powers that went far beyond mere military might? The reality of American logistical capability in the Pacific was a marvel, almost incomprehensible to the Japanese. While imperial forces struggled to maintain supply lines to even their most critical outposts, often relying on captured provisions or living off the land, the United States military was building an astonishing supply chain. By early 1944, this chain could deliver not just ammunition and medical supplies, but also fresh meats, vegetables, ice cream, and yes, pancake mix and maple syrup, thousands of miles across the vast ocean to remote jungle outposts. This wasn't just about feeding troops, it was about maintaining morale, a subtle but powerful psychological advantage. Consider the sheer scale. Transporting foodstuffs that required refrigeration or careful packaging through submarine-infested waters, across thousands of miles of open ocean, to islands like Bougainville or Guadalcanal, where fierce fighting was still commonplace. This wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate, massive undertaking orchestrated by figures like Admiral Chester Nimitz, who understood that a well-fed soldier was a fighting soldier. The contrast between this abundance and the Japanese experience was stark. Japanese soldiers often fought on starvation rations, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and tropical diseases. Their supply ships, if they even made it through the gauntlet of Allied air and sea patrols, often carried little more than rice, dried fish, and limited medical supplies. The idea of fresh, hot pancakes, a luxury even in peacetime, being served to enemy prisoners was utterly alien. It chipped away at the core of their understanding of the enemy. The Americans weren't just powerful, they were rich in a way that defied the Japanese military's grim, ascetic reality. This wasn't just about calories, it was about a profound difference in doctrine, in strategy, and in the very value placed on human life, even that of an enemy. What would your decision have been at this point if you were a Japanese officer observing this scene? Would you dismiss it as a trick, or would you begin to question everything you'd been taught? Let us know in the comments. The profound difference wasn't merely about caloric intake. It was a chasm in doctrine, in strategy, and in the fundamental value placed on human life, even that of an enemy. Imperial Japan's Bushido Code, while emphasizing honor and duty, also fostered a culture where individual soldiers were often seen as expendable assets in service of the greater empire. Their military leadership, epitomized by figures like General Hideki Tojo, consistently prioritized offensive action and fanatical resistance over the well-being or even the basic survival of their troops once committed to battle. This philosophy manifested in desperate banzai charges and the refusal to surrender, often resulting in catastrophic loss of life for their own forces. For them, a soldier's value was in his fight, not his continued existence after capture. Conversely, the United States, while prosecuting a brutal war, adhered to a different ethos. The American military, guided by the principles of the Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but largely disregarded in practice concerning Allied POWs, was committed to humane treatment for prisoners. This wasn't solely altruism. It was a pragmatic decision rooted in the understanding that such treatment could yield invaluable intelligence and uphold a moral standard. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's Office, responsible for POW affairs, ensured that even amidst the chaos of battle, captured enemy personnel received proper food, medical care, and shelter. This policy was a deliberate counterpoint to the enemy's propaganda, designed to sow doubt and encourage further surrenders, however rare they might initially be. For Private Ishikawa, the pancakes were not just food. They were a direct assault on his deepest convictions. Every American propaganda leaflet he'd been warned against, every chilling rumor of Allied savagery, crumbled with each bite of sweet, warm dough. He saw not a demon, but a calm medic, a young man who shared a meal with him, offering a stark, undeniable contradiction to everything he had been taught about his captors. This wasn't the brutal, torturous enemy described in countless Imperial Army briefings. It was an enemy capable of unexpected, almost disorienting kindness. This small, intimate act of providing sustenance began to chip away at the rigid mental fortifications that had defined his entire military existence, creating a cognitive dissonance that would prove difficult to reconcile. The strategic implications of this policy, though subtle at first, began to accumulate. The humane treatment of Japanese prisoners, including the provision of familiar comforts like a decent meal, slowly but surely encouraged a trickle of intelligence. While mass surrenders remained rare until the war's final days, the increasing number of individual surrenders and the crucial information gleaned from these men provided invaluable insights. Intelligence units, often working alongside linguists from the Military Intelligence Service, were able to piece together Japanese defensive preparations, troop movements, and, perhaps most critically, the rapidly deteriorating morale within Imperial units. This was intelligence that saved countless American lives in subsequent island assaults, transforming the breakfast table into an unlikely potent instrument of psychological warfare. This seemingly minor detail of a pancake breakfast underscored a vast logistical and moral chasm between the two belligerents. It wasn't just about overwhelming firepower, though that was certainly a factor. It was about a level of resource management and a cultural approach to human life that was utterly alien to their adversaries. The ability to provide such luxuries to prisoners while Japanese soldiers starved was a testament to a system that valued its people and possessed an industrial might that dwarfed anything the empire could muster. How could an army that treated its enemies so well be the barbaric force they were told to despise? This question, unspoken but potent, began to resonate not just with captured soldiers, but with those still fighting, as tales of American treatment slowly filtered back through the lines. The simple act of serving pancakes was a silent, powerful declaration of an enemy unlike any they had conceived, and it started to unravel the very fabric of their fanatical doctrine. The experience of Private Ishikawa, encountering such unexpected humanity, was not an isolated incident, nor was it accidental. The U.S. military had a deliberate policy, refined through early engagements, to treat Japanese prisoners humanely. This wasn't merely out of adherence to international law, but a calculated strategy, a psychological gambit in a war often defined by brutal, uncompromising combat. American intelligence officers, recognizing the deep indoctrination of imperial soldiers, understood that a direct interrogation was often futile. Instead, they sought to exploit the cognitive dissonance created by the stark contrast between Japanese propaganda and the reality of American captivity. They knew that a soldier expecting torture and starvation, but instead receiving medical care, clean quarters, and 3 square meals, sometimes even including luxuries like pancakes, would be profoundly disoriented. This disorientation was the first crack in the psychological armor. The Military Intelligence Service, particularly the Nisei linguists, Japanese Americans who served with incredible distinction, were crucial in Na. They weren't just translators, they were cultural bridges, understanding the nuances of honor and shame that governed a Japanese soldier's mind. Their approach was often subtle, building trust not through force, but through consistent, humane treatment. By early 1944, at facilities like the one on Guadalcanal or the larger POW camps established in Hawaii, these specialists observed that a comfortable, safe environment combined with patient, respectful questioning yielded far more valuable intelligence than any harsh methods. The very act of providing a decent meal, a moment of normalcy in a world turned upside down, opened doors that brute force never could. Consider the strategic implications. If a captured soldier, initially terrified and defiant, slowly began to trust his captors, even a little, the potential for intelligence was immense. He might reveal details about troop dispositions, defensive fortifications, or the effectiveness of Japanese weaponry. He might speak of his unit's morale, their supply shortages, or the locations of hidden caches. This wasn't about breaking a man's will through cruelty, but gently eroding the false narratives that had sustained him. The information gathered from hundreds of such individual interactions was meticulously collated by intelligence analysts, painting an increasingly detailed picture of Imperial Japan's capabilities and vulnerabilities. This was intelligence that would directly influence the planning for major operations like the invasion of Peleliu in September 1944 and the subsequent landings on Leyte. But the psychological impact extended beyond just intelligence gathering. The U.S. military also began to leverage these accounts for propaganda. Leaflets, often dropped by air, depicted well-fed Japanese prisoners, sometimes even enjoying American food, contrasting sharply with the emaciated figures shown in imperial propaganda. These leaflets, meticulously designed by the psychological warfare branch, were not always believed immediately, but they planted seeds of doubt. For soldiers enduring starvation on isolated islands, the image of a comrade enjoying a full meal, free from the constant threat of death, was a powerful, if disturbing, thought. It suggested an alternative to the fight-to-the-death doctrine, a path that might lead to survival rather than certain demise. It was a slow, agonizing process, but this subtle erosion of morale, this chipping away at the foundation of Bushido, was a critical, often overlooked, front in the Pacific War. The contrast between the American military's meticulous attention to prisoner welfare and the Japanese military's often brutal disregard for the same, even for their own men, became a stark, undeniable truth. While American logistical efforts were delivering hot meals and medical supplies to POWs, Japanese units were suffering from rampant disease and starvation. On islands like New Guinea, during the campaign of 1943 to 1944, estimates suggest that for every Japanese soldier killed in combat, 4 died from disease or hunger. This wasn't just a failure of logistics, it was a systemic failure rooted in a doctrine that prioritized conquest over sustenance, honor over survival. The pancakes, then, were not just a meal. They were a symbol of a fundamental difference in how each nation valued human life. A difference that would ultimately prove as decisive as any naval battle or air raid. This wasn't just about the strength of an army. It was about the strength of an entire system. How could a military so seemingly powerful be so utterly unprepared for the basic needs of its fighting men? The answer lay in a deep-seated cultural and strategic blindness that the Americans were now expertly exploiting. The Imperial Japanese military's strategic blindness stemmed from an almost fanatical adherence to offensive spirit and a profound underestimation of the logistical demands of modern warfare. Their initial successes in 1941 and 1942, built on speed and daring, fostered a dangerous complacency. Leaders like General Tomoyuki Yamashita, despite his tactical brilliance in Malaya, often operated with a mindset that assumed local resources would sustain his forces, or that rapid victory would negate the need for extensive supply lines. This became a catastrophic miscalculation as the war of maneuver turned into a grinding war of attrition across vast, unforgiving distances. On Guadalcanal in 1942, for instance, Japanese forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, were often reduced to eating roots and leaves, fighting not just the Americans, but rampant dysentery and malaria. Their supply vessels, the Tokyo Express, were routinely decimated by Allied air and sea power, leaving thousands of soldiers stranded and starving. The doctrine simply hadn't accounted for such sustained, overwhelming logistical pressure from an enemy. This systemic flaw was not lost on American intelligence. While Private Ishikawa was digesting his pancakes, specialists at the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, often operating out of Australia, were meticulously piecing together the true state of Japanese forces. Their analysis wasn't just based on captured documents. It was increasingly informed by the accounts of the few Japanese soldiers who did surrender. These prisoners, disoriented by their humane treatment, slowly began to reveal critical information. They spoke of the brutal conditions on islands like New Georgia, where rations were scarce and medical supplies non-existent. They detailed the specific locations of hidden artillery, the strength of defensive perimeters, and the morale of their fellow soldiers, often describing units on the verge of collapse from hunger and disease. This intelligence provided a stark contrast to the official Japanese communiques, which maintained a facade of unwavering resolve. The actionable insights gained from these POWs were immediate and impactful. For example, during the planning for the invasion of Kwajalein Atoll in January 1944, intelligence gathered from captured personnel provided detailed layouts of Japanese fortifications, including previously unknown underground bunkers and mutually supporting strongpoints. This crucial data allowed American commanders, like Major General Holland M. Smith of the 4th Marine Division, to refine their bombardment plans and assault tactics, minimizing casualties and accelerating the capture of key objectives. Without this granular intelligence, the cost of taking such heavily defended positions would have been exponentially higher. The seemingly small act of providing a meal to a captured soldier was directly contributing to the strategic advantage of the United States. But the impact extended beyond direct military intelligence. The stories of humane treatment, though initially dismissed as American deception, began to slowly permeate the Japanese ranks. The U.S. Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch were highly adept at crafting propaganda leaflets, specifically designed to exploit this cognitive dissonance. These leaflets, often dropped by air or delivered by artillery shell, depicted images of well-fed Japanese prisoners, sometimes even playing baseball or enjoying hearty meals, clearly contrasting with the emaciated, malaria-ridden figures of soldiers still fighting. While many Japanese soldiers remained fiercely loyal and skeptical, the sheer persistence of these messages, combined with the increasingly dire reality of their own existence, started to plant tiny seeds of doubt. Could it be true that surrender didn't mean torture? Could there be an alternative to a certain, painful death? This wasn't a sudden mass conversion. The ingrained Bushido code was far too powerful for that. But for individual soldiers on the brink of starvation, facing overwhelming firepower, these subtle messages offered a glimpse of a different reality. The very existence of American logistical superiority, capable of providing such comforts even to enemies, was a testament to a power far beyond what imperial propaganda had ever admitted. It showcased an enemy not just stronger, but fundamentally different in its approach to human life and welfare, even for those it fought. This wasn't merely about winning battles. It was about undermining the very ideological foundations of the enemy's will to fight. The question was, how deeply could these seeds of doubt penetrate the collective consciousness of an army that had been taught to despise surrender above all else? And what would happen when those doubts began to blossom in the face of inevitable defeat? The strategic architects in Washington and Pearl Harbor, including figures like Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Admiral Ernest King, understood that the war in the Pacific would be long and bloody. They knew that every advantage, however small, needed to be leveraged. The policy of humane treatment for POWs, therefore, became a deliberate, long-term psychological operation, an investment in future intelligence and a subtle attack on enemy morale. It was a stark departure from the brutal reciprocity often seen in other theaters of war. The American philosophy recognized that even a fanatical enemy could be swayed by undeniable evidence that contradicted their deepest fears and beliefs. The pancakes, the maple syrup, the hot coffee, these weren't just calories. They were carefully deployed symbols in a war of ideas, demonstrating a level of care and resource that the Japanese High Command simply could not replicate for their own beleaguered forces. This strategic patience, this willingness to play the long game on the psychological front, was as critical as any naval blockade or amphibious landing. The stories filtering back to the front lines, often through captured documents or the rare returning soldier, painted a picture that was increasingly difficult for imperial commanders to dismiss as mere propaganda. They found themselves battling not just American firepower, but a creeping internal erosion of faith. Soldiers on isolated garrisons, suffering from malnutrition and disease, would hear whispered tales of comrades who had been captured and, against all expectations, were alive and even relatively well. This created a profound dilemma: how to reconcile the official narrative of American barbarism with the growing anecdotal evidence of American magnanimity. This dissonance was a far more insidious weapon than any bullet, slowly corroding the absolute loyalty that was the bedrock of the Imperial Army's fighting spirit, creating an internal conflict that mirrored the external one. The sheer scale of American industrial output, which underwrote this logistical miracle, was another silent weapon. By 1944, the U.S. was producing an astonishing amount of war material, from ships to planes to canned goods, far outstripping Japan's capacity. This wasn't just about military hardware. It was about the ability to sustain a high quality of life for its fighting forces, even in the harshest environments. The fact that an American soldier could expect regular mail, fresh food, and comprehensive medical care, while his Japanese counterpart might go weeks without proper rations, was a constant, demoralizing contrast. This material abundance, symbolized by something as simple as a pancake breakfast, was a concrete manifestation of America's overwhelming power, not just militarily, but economically and industrially. It demonstrated a capability that Japan, with its limited resources and overextended empire, could never hope to match. This wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a clash of entire systems, and one system was proving itself vastly superior in its ability to support and sustain its people. The deep-seated cultural and strategic blindness of Imperial Japan, though seemingly impenetrable, was slowly being chipped away by the stark, undeniable realities presented by their enemy. The American strategy wasn't just about winning battles. It was about exposing the fundamental flaws in a doctrine that had led Japan down a path of self-destruction. The whispers of humane treatment, initially dismissed as crude American deception, began to gain an insidious traction within the ranks, particularly among those facing the grim reality of starvation and relentless combat. On islands like Biak in May 1944, where the Japanese 35th Infantry Division fought with desperate tenacity, soldiers were not only battling superior American firepower, but also the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs and the relentless advance of tropical diseases. The idea that an alternative to death or dishonor might exist, however faint, began to take root in minds pushed to the absolute breaking point. This slow erosion of faith was meticulously tracked by American intelligence. The Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, already mentioned, refined its methods, understanding that the psychological state of a prisoner was as important as the raw data they possessed. They didn't just ask about troop movements, they asked about feelings, about the efficacy of propaganda, about the morale of specific units. These Nisei linguists, with their intimate understanding of Japanese culture, became adept at identifying the subtle shifts in a prisoner's demeanor, recognizing when the initial defiance gave way to a weary willingness to speak. They understood that a soldier who had just experienced a hot meal, perhaps even the unexpected sweetness of pancakes, was more likely to open up than one who had been subjected to harsh interrogation. This wasn't weakness. It was an applied psychology of conflict, a subtle leveraging of human needs against rigid ideology. The tangible results of this approach were profound. During the preparations for the invasion of Guam in July 1944, for instance, intelligence derived from captured Japanese soldiers provided critical details about the intricate network of caves and pillboxes that formed the island's formidable defenses. These prisoners, treated with a respect that defied their indoctrination, revealed the locations of underground command posts and supply depots, even detailing the types of weapons deployed in specific sectors. This information allowed American forces, led by Marine Lieutenant General Roy S. Geiger, to precisely target their naval bombardments and airstrikes, saving countless lives by neutralizing key defensive positions before the main landing. It transformed the battlefield from a deadly guessing game into a calculated assault, all thanks to the quiet, patient work of intelligence officers and the disorienting effect of unexpected kindness. Moreover, the psychological warfare extended beyond direct intelligence. The U.S. Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch continued to flood Japanese-held areas with leaflets designed to amplify this cognitive dissonance. These weren't just generic messages. They were often tailored to specific units, sometimes even featuring photographs of recently captured soldiers from that very unit, looking healthy and well-fed, contrasting sharply with the emaciated forms of their comrades still in the field. One particular leaflet, dropped over Peleliu in September 1944, showed Japanese prisoners enjoying a game of volleyball, a stark image against the backdrop of the brutal no-quarter fighting on the island. While many Japanese commanders ordered these leaflets to be destroyed and soldiers feared severe punishment for possessing them, the sheer volume and consistency of these messages made them impossible to fully suppress. They were a constant, nagging reminder that the American narrative of barbarism was in fact a lie. The contrast wasn't just about food. It was about the fundamental respect for human dignity that underpinned the American. This was a profound shock to men who had been taught that their captors would be savage beasts and who themselves had often treated Allied prisoners with extreme brutality, in direct violation of international conventions. The ability of the Americans to maintain a consistent moral standard, even in the crucible of total war, spoke volumes about the strength of their societal values and their logistical capacity to uphold those values. It demonstrated a confidence that went beyond military might, a belief in a system that valued life, even enemy life, in a way that Imperial Japan simply could not comprehend. This wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a moral one, slowly but surely undermining the very foundations of the enemy's will to fight. What would happen when this moral chasm became too wide for even the most fanatical soldier to ignore? The moral chasm, once a subtle crack, widened with each passing month, becoming too vast for even the most fanatical soldier to ignore entirely. It wasn't just the physical reality of starvation versus abundance. It was the psychological assault of a narrative shattered. The imperial doctrine, which had promised glory in death and barbarism in capture, found itself confronted by undeniable, tangible proof of an enemy operating under a completely different code. This wasn't a sudden cataclysmic collapse, but a gradual, insidious erosion, like water wearing down stone. The individual soldier, starved and demoralized, began to question the very foundations of his beliefs, a process far more devastating than any physical wound. Consider the psychological torment of a Japanese soldier still fighting on a jungle island in mid-1944, who sees a leaflet depicting his captured comrade, Private Ishikawa perhaps, looking healthy, even smiling, enjoying a meal that would be a dream for those still in the field. The dissonance was unbearable. His commanders, bound by their own indoctrination, would condemn it as a crude trick, a lie. Yet, the image persisted. The hunger in his own gut was real. The constant fear of death was real. The promise of a dignified end, of an honorable death, seemed increasingly hollow against the backdrop of an enemy who offered sustenance and survival even to those they captured. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a mirror reflecting the stark, brutal truth of their own desperate situation. The trickle of individual surrenders, though never a flood, steadily increased as the war progressed. These weren't mass surrenders born of tactical defeat, but often desperate, solitary acts by soldiers pushed beyond their physical and mental limits. Each man who chose life over certain death carried with him a piece of the puzzle. The intelligence gathered from these increasing numbers of prisoners proved invaluable. They spoke of the deteriorating health of their units, the exact locations of supply dumps, the morale of specific commanders, and the desperate measures taken to conserve dwindling ammunition. This wasn't merely tactical data, it was a window into the soul of a dying army, revealing its weaknesses, its fears, and its breaking points. This information allowed American forces under commanders like General Douglas MacArthur to refine their island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified but strategically insignificant positions, and focusing their overwhelming power where it would be most effective, saving thousands of Allied lives. The silent weapon of pancakes and humane treatment was now actively shaping the battlefield. It wasn't just about the psychological impact on the individual. It was about the systemic advantage gained from accurate, real-time intelligence. The American military, with its vast resources, was not only fighting a war of attrition, it was fighting a war of information, meticulously gathering every scrap of data to minimize its own casualties and accelerate the enemy's defeat. The Japanese High Command, still clinging to an outdated doctrine that viewed surrender as impossible, was blind to the true extent of this psychological penetration. They continued to issue orders for suicidal resistance, unaware that the very foundation of their soldiers' resolve was being systematically undermined. One meal, one kind word, one leaflet at a time. This wasn't just a clash of arms, it was a clash of fundamental worldviews. The American capacity to extend humane treatment to its enemies, even in the midst of a brutal conflict, was a testament to a societal structure that prioritized human life and possessed the industrial might to uphold that principle. It was a level of resource management and a cultural approach utterly alien to their adversaries, whose soldiers were taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, and whose logistical system often condemned them to starvation. The stark contrast was a powerful, unspoken message. We can afford to be humane because our system is superior. This wasn't merely an act of compassion. It was a calculated demonstration of overwhelming strength, a quiet assertion of dominance that transcended the battlefield. Hold this detail for a second, because it redefines everything that comes next in the unraveling of Imperial Japan. The implications rippled further, beyond the immediate intelligence value. As the war moved into its final, most brutal phases, the Philippines campaign in late 1944, the invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945, and the horrific battle for Okinawa starting in April 1945, the psychological warfare intensified. The U.S. Office of War Information, working closely with military intelligence, refined its leaflet drops. They moved beyond generic images to highly specific messages, sometimes even printing the names of captured Japanese soldiers, assuring their families of their well-being, directly contradicting imperial propaganda that claimed all prisoners were executed. These efforts were designed to exploit the very moral chasm that had begun with a simple breakfast, encouraging not just individual surrenders, but also fostering a creeping doubt among the civilian population in Japan, who were increasingly questioning the government's narrative as the war turned decisively against them. The pancakes, once a minor anomaly, had become a symbol of a deeper systemic truth that would ultimately prove impossible for Imperial Japan to ignore. This systemic truth, once a quiet whisper, became an undeniable roar as the Pacific War entered its final, most desperate chapters. The American psychological warfare apparatus, far from being a blunt instrument, evolved into a precision tool. It recognized that simply showing well-fed prisoners wasn't enough. The message had to be tailored, insidious, and relentless. Radio broadcasts, beaming from stations like the Voice of America, transmitted messages of humane treatment directly into Japanese-held territories, often featuring recorded testimonies from actual POWs. These were not generic appeals. They often included specific details, such as the names of units captured on Saipan in June 1944, or the precise locations where individual soldiers had surrendered. The goal was to dismantle the carefully constructed edifice of imperial propaganda, brick by painstaking brick. Japanese commanders, facing this relentless barrage, found themselves in an impossible position. They issued strict orders for troops to ignore all American propaganda, to destroy leaflets on sight, and to report anyone caught discussing them. Punishment for even possessing such materials was severe, often involving execution. Yet the sheer volume and persistence of these messages, combined with the increasingly dire reality on the ground, made complete suppression impossible. On islands like Peleliu, where the 1st Marine Division fought a brutal battle in September 1944, Japanese soldiers under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa clung to their positions with fanatical resolve. But even there, amidst the carnage, the psychological seeds were being sown. The contrast between their own starvation and the images of enemy care was a constant, gnawing presence. The impact rippled, albeit slowly, across the Pacific theater. While mass surrenders remained rare until the very end, the increasing number of individual surrenders and the intelligence gleaned from these prisoners provided invaluable insights into Japanese defensive preparations, troop movements, and morale, information that saved countless American lives in subsequent island assaults. This seemingly small detail of a breakfast meal became an unlikely, potent instrument of psychological warfare, demonstrating the vast logistical and moral chasm between the two belligerents. It underscored that the American way of war wasn't just about overwhelming firepower, but also about a level of resource management and a cultural approach to human life that was utterly alien to their adversaries. The meticulous analysis of these POW testimonies by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, was critical. Nisei linguists, leveraging their deep cultural understanding, didn't just translate words. They interpreted nuances, detected psychological shifts, and identified vulnerabilities in the Japanese fighting spirit. They learned that the promise of a simple meal, a warm blanket, or basic medical attention could, in the right circumstances, break through years of rigid indoctrination. This wasn't about breaking men through torture, but about disarming them with unexpected kindness, a strategy that yielded far more reliable and actionable intelligence. The intelligence derived from a captured Japanese naval officer in the Philippines in late 1944, for instance, provided crucial details about the layout of Lingayen Gulf's defenses, directly influencing General MacArthur's landing strategy in January 1945. This wasn't simply a humanitarian gesture. It was a calculated, strategic investment. The United States understood that the war would be won, not just by bombs and bullets, but by undermining the enemy's will to fight. The ability to provide such comforts to prisoners, even as their own forces starved, showcased an industrial and logistical might that was simply unimaginable to the Japanese. It was a concrete, undeniable manifestation of American superiority, a fact more devastating than any abstract ideological argument. The pancakes, the maple syrup, they weren't just food. They were a symbol of a system that valued life, even the lives of its enemies, and possessed the means to uphold that value on a global scale. This profound difference in worldview and capability was slowly but surely eroding the very foundations of Imperial Japan's fanatical doctrine, setting the stage for an ultimate unraveling. What would happen when this erosion reached the civilian population, already suffering under the weight of a losing war? The erosion, once confined to the minds of desperate soldiers, inevitably began to seep into the collective consciousness of the Japanese civilian population, already suffering under the relentless weight of a losing war. On the home islands, the narrative of a glorious struggle, of a sacred land protected by divine winds and an invincible imperial army, was crumbling under the relentless Allied strategic bombing campaign. Cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were being systematically reduced to ash, their wooden structures consumed by firestorms. By early 1945, the daily struggle for survival was paramount. Food was scarce, rationing severe, and the promise of victory felt increasingly hollow against the backdrop of unimaginable destruction and loss. Into this crucible of fear and deprivation, the psychological warfare efforts of the United States began to find new, fertile ground. The same leaflets that depicted healthy, well-fed Japanese prisoners, previously dismissed as crude tricks by battle-hardened soldiers, now carried a different, more insidious weight for civilians. These images, sometimes showing men enjoying a baseball game or sharing a meal, contrasted sharply with the gaunt faces of their own countrymen starving amidst the ruins. The government's propaganda machine, which had for years demonized Americans as barbaric devils, found its credibility strained to breaking point. How could these devils treat their enemies with such apparent care, while their own sons and husbands were dying of starvation in distant jungles? The cognitive dissonance was profound, a quiet poison seeping into the national psyche. The sheer logistical capacity required to feed and house thousands of enemy prisoners, often with a level of comfort unimaginable to the average Japanese citizen, spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the pancakes. It was the implicit message of an adversary possessing such overwhelming resources that they could afford to be humane, even generous, to those they had captured. This contrasted starkly with the dire reality of Japan's wartime economy, which by 1945 was on the verge of total collapse, unable to adequately supply its own troops, let alone its civilian population. The American approach was a silent, devastating demonstration of industrial might and a societal value system that, despite the horrors of war, still prioritized human welfare in a way that Imperial Japan's fanatical doctrine simply could not. The stories, whether from returning, wounded soldiers or whispered through clandestine channels, of American generosity towards prisoners, chipped away at the carefully constructed edifice of imperial authority. While official channels continued to preach total war and honorable death, the lived experience of deprivation and the insidious spread of alternative narratives fostered a growing sense of disillusionment. The question wasn't just if Japan could win, but at what cost and for whom. The promise of a glorious empire had delivered only devastation, and the perceived barbarity of the enemy was increasingly exposed as a lie by the very evidence they produced. This subtle shift in public opinion, though not yet a rebellion, created a fertile environment for eventual surrender, challenging the very core of the nation's resolve. This wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a strategic unraveling, reaching into the heart of the Japanese will to resist. The American military understood that total victory required not just the destruction of military capacity, but the dismantling of the ideological framework that sustains the conflict. The gentle, unexpected kindness shown to captured soldiers, from Private Ishikawa onward, became a symbol of this deeper conflict. It presented a stark, undeniable truth that the enemy was not the subhuman monster depicted by their propaganda, and that an alternative to fanatical death existed. This truth, delivered in the form of a hot meal or a simple blanket, became a powerful, silent weapon, accelerating the inevitable collapse of Imperial Japan's ability to wage war, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of its people. The question now was how this deep-seated psychological shift would manifest in the final, desperate days of the war. The deep-seated psychological shift, initially a tremor within the minds of captured soldiers, culminated in the final, desperate days of a war that had become unsustainable. As the firebombing intensified, as cities burned and the populace starved, the stark contrast between the enemy's perceived barbarity and the reality of their humane treatment of prisoners became undeniable. It was a truth that resonated far beyond the battlefield. When the Emperor, Hirohito, finally announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, citing a desire to avoid the total extinction of human civilization, he was speaking to a nation whose will to resist had already been fundamentally eroded, not just by overwhelming military force, but by a relentless psychological campaign that had chipped away at its core beliefs. The image of a Japanese soldier, expecting torture or starvation, instead finding a plate of pancakes and maple syrup on a U.S. Navy ship in early 1944, wasn't merely a curiosity. It was a potent, silent weapon. It embodied the vast logistical and moral chasm between two warring nations. It demonstrated that the American way of war wasn't solely about overwhelming firepower, but about a level of resource management and a cultural approach to human life, even that of an enemy, that was utterly alien to Imperial Japan's fanatical doctrine. This seemingly minor detail became a symbol of an adversary so powerful, so abundant, that it could afford compassion, thereby dismantling the propaganda that fueled suicidal resistance. This wasn't just a story of individual surrenders. It was a masterclass in strategic communication. The intelligence gleaned from those prisoners, from Private Ishikawa to the highest-ranking officers, saved countless American lives by informing island-hopping tactics and pinpointing enemy weaknesses. It showed how a seemingly simple act of humanity could become a devastatingly effective instrument of psychological warfare, influencing everything from troop morale to national policy. The lesson remains clear. In any conflict, the human element, the clash of values and perceptions, can be as decisive as any weapon. Understanding an opponent's worldview and subtly undermining its foundations can be the most powerful strategy of all. So the next time you see a plate of pancakes, remember the profound, unexpected role it played in the Pacific Theater. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours of war, the smallest acts can carry the greatest weight, challenging deeply held beliefs and ultimately reshaping history. If this deep dive into an overlooked aspect of World War II made you think differently, subscribe now to World War II Beyond Battles so you don't miss our next chapter. Drop a like if you want us to keep exploring these hidden stories, and tell us in the comments what part of this journey surprised you the most. We read every comment and use your insights to shape what comes next. And if you're curious about how other cultural clashes impacted the war, you won't want to miss our video on the Navajo Code Talkers.